Okay,
Okay,
got it.
great. Hi. So I guess let's just start with, what's your name and where are you calling from?
Well, I go by Touchsoundart, and my actual name is Oksana Kryzhanivska. And I adopted this new name because of the different approaches to the NFTs and crypto, because I'm located right now in China. Although I come from Ukraine and I have lived in Canada for quite a while and then relocated to China just before the whole COVID thing started. Um, and uh, what else did you ask? Sorry.
I just asked where your name and where you're calling from.
hmm
Um, and what is your piece called?
My artwork is called Crystals of Memory, and this name comes from the idea that I wanted to explore parametric modeling for exploring the concept of how our memories kind of build up and then they break down. So I was trying to figure out a way of reflecting that in a process and building these kind of crystal shapes.
Beautiful. And when did you make the piece?
I made the piece in May, and this was actually done during my residency with Belgrade Art Studio. They have an online residency that artists can participate, and because the world was kind of reopening at that time, but I was still stuck with only doing online things. So I was working on that piece then, and also it reflects the topics of you know the invasion of Russia into Ukraine. So the residency was built around the whole idea of conflict, art, and peace, and how artists actually can do something. And we were trying to figure out whether artists actually have anything they can do in the state when your country is in a state of war. So that was kind of how this piece came along.
Yeah, I mean, I think art is such a profound way to preserve memory outside of language. And, I've studied so much art that comes from conflict. It seems really clearly valuable, but I'm really excited to talk more about this. Um, and what was your workflow to create the piece?
Yeah, so this is kind of the main um thing that I don't know if it comes across in in the final artwork or not, but what I was trying to do is I was trying to create a work that's process based and really trying to think about how we remember and what happens to our memories. So because of the war, I am actually unable to visit Ukraine even now because it's so complicated you cannot directly fly into Ukraine anymore. You have to go probably to Poland or some neighboring country like Slovakia, and then you have to either take a train or a private car to get into your hometown. And I wasn't able to do that, because of work and other time commitments. And um, I was trying to think about what are the things that I actually retain about my home place and how those memories were reshaped. Because right now, my main interaction with my hometown and my friends and my family is happening through the social media. So I was thinking about those images that I see in online in the media. So I was using some references from Google Maps, Street View, and I was trying to recreate these places that in my memory are now shaped as these fragments. Like I barely remember some of them, even though I lived in my hometown until I was 15 years old. And some of these places, they also changed since I left. So what I started was I was writing a piece of code that takes my small models of crystals. So I kind of hand built some models of crystal components, and then I coded them to build up the shape in a generative way to combine them together. And after that was done, so that's kind of a symbolizing the process of us building up our memories. So after that was done, I had another code that I wrote, and I work with Maya for these things. So after that was done, I wrote another piece of code that actually deconstructs these. So whenever the shapes were intersecting and they were overlapping, the code would actually chip away parts of these shapes and create these kind of broken structures. So I actually took this large shape that was created, and then I broke them up into several zones. So there are actually 7 different zones that I mapped with some images. And these are images of the places in my hometown. So I picked 7. I actually picked originally 9 places, but at the end I picked 7 places after I started writing about them. So that was actually a new thing for me to include text and try to talk about these memories in a text form in a very short snippets. And these text descriptions, they're not very descriptive. They're more like metaphors or the kind of things they remind me of. So for example, I have a place called Slonik, which is translated from Ukrainian. It's an elephant, and there's this elephant in the park where I used to go to school every day, and this elephant was covered in graffiti and then repainted, and it kind of doesn't look the same way. And then at some points, the area was overgrown with shrubs and bushes and so on. So I had to kind of reflect on that idea of my childhood and my friends and kind of things like that. And for the images, it was also an interesting process for me because I didn't want to take, the Google Maps images by themselves. I wanted to take them as a starting point and inspiration. So what I did actually, I shrunk those Google images by something like they were at the end about 200 pixels in size, and I fed those into AI, and AI generated the details of these places based on these very tiny shrunk images. And I don't know how much you know about AI as a process. So I was using something called VQ Gun Clip and uh, some other upscaling. So these are kind of open source scripts. I didn't write these scripts, but what I did was I kind of fed them through these several scripts to upscale and fill in these details. And obviously the details become kind of weird and the colors changed. And it reminded me of this process of also how when we are remembering things are kind of get a little bit surreal in our memories.
That's so beautiful. I'm really glad to hear the process. It's like really, really rich. It's so interesting I mean, the sort of formation of the shapes almost mirrors the way that crystals are maybe formed in real life.
Uh,
Um,
well, yeah, and that's what I was thinking about. I was thinking about how, in that sense, our Earth is also like a representation of memory in a more long-term scale, because when the Earth forms, there are things that build up like the rocks and the landscape, and then erosion of wind and water, they take away from these things. And then the things we see at the end are kind of this um, constant flux of building and removing.
yeah, it's like a really, really rich process. And so I'm curious, like, what was your practice like before the pandemic? Like, did you work in virtual space before? Or yeah, I'm curious about the movement.
Well, actually, my movement toward virtual space didn't start during pandemic. I think during pandemic, what happened is that there these kind of works became suddenly interesting to others. Um, but well, actually, I started out as a sculptor. So my first sculptural media was stone carving. And I guess maybe that's why I'm also thinking about this idea of terraforming in my work. No, but yeah, so I did a bunch of stone carving and I did some metal casting, and then I have done um, uh, kind of 3D scanning and CNC kind of work back in 2008. So I was interested in these digital technologies for a while because of the way we see through machines is kind of different from the way humans see. And it just fascinated me for a long time. So after that, I kind of dove into the interactive installation art, and I've done some sculptures where I would embed electronics and make the sculptures react. So at that time was more interested in the idea of the sculpture becoming four-dimensional medium. So introducing the time component into the sculptural work, and that would sometimes use music. At that time, I collaborated with a very great musician, and uh, from there, I kind of learned my way into making my own music, which I did for this artwork. So then I think when I was working with these interactive sculptures, I always imagined them to be the controllers for some kind of virtual worlds, and I would want people to have these objects in their hands and have these objects that they touch and squeeze to be actually something they manipulate and interact with, something like a game or simulation. So I started learning these tools because those tools were quite new to me and they take a while to learn. And I started working on the digital modeling and learning how to code, learning how to sculpt by hand. I do quite a lot of work right now where I actually just sculpt by hand and build worlds out of that. So yeah, so it was kind of gradual. And then um, I was always looking for these kind of opportunities to interact with the community and make digital work and also have the discourse around the digital work, because sometimes um, it's great to have a conversation with more traditional artists, but sometimes it's also great to have someone who is also working in that media and um, see what kind of conceptual and technical challenges they face. So uh, when the pandemic started, that I felt like that was actually the time when people started highlighting these projects and they become more visible and there are more places to exhibit and see other works. So that's kind of my gradual transition towards the metaverse kind of projects. And I also believe that web XR means VR and browser kind of web 3D and augmented reality. They're also more accessible to people compared to the more fancy virtual reality worlds, because not everyone has a device and not everyone has a super powerful computer to run these things. So that is another reason I started exploring these starting about 2019, 2018.
Wow, that's really, really cool. I mean, such a fantastic process. And yeah, it feels really like natural and like connected. Um, and so my next question is, how long had it been since you created the space that you returned to it for this project?
Well, this space, I worked on it, I think it was April, May, and a little bit of June. So kind of thinking about the topics first and trying to experiment with the coding parts of this model building. And then the piece had to be done by the end of the residency. And I didn't plan to do some big exhibition for it. I think for me it was more like having some community support to try to think about these ideas instead of working by myself. And I was happy to submit this for the festival, so maybe it will get a little bit visibility.
Totally. And so, like, how does it feel to come back almost a year later to the space after you made it?
I think it's great. I mean, I feel like from the people that have seen it, uh, they have very positive experiences from it, and it's designed to be an immersive space. So you kind of enter it and you're supposed to almost meditate in this floating world. I really like the process that was almost invented from this idea for me, and I do continue working with this process in my other artwork. So both using the AI for generating textures, something that may be different from the hand painting things, and also with the music as well, just trying to really combine the music with the sculptural work.
It's really, really cool. And one of my interview questions is like, how does it feel to visually describe your work after you made it some time ago? But I understand that the visual description or the alt text was like a stylistic feature from the beginning. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Yes, so I was actually very excited to work with New Art City as a hosting place, because the features that are available here are a little bit different from other metaverse projects. And what I really appreciated about this project is that New Art City is really focusing on the arts and more like contemporary arts in this 3D world building, and allows for different kind of media to be displayed. And one of the things that really attracted me was the having of this alt text, because I wanted to experiment with the writing for my work. I wanted to have, I mean, sometimes you can add voice over for this, but I wanted to have the soundtrack to be the only sound in the space at this point. So these reflections that I wrote for each space, they were part of the experience. So when you're lost in this immersive crystal, you're actually not sure where you are. And the only indication that I wanted to give to the viewer is these little descriptions. So every time they point or their view into a specific section of this artwork, they would read a description. So for example, the artwork part that's called Entrance to Pedestrian Lane reads the following. You wish to speak to your mother tongue, so you remember what it was like to be held in tight and warm arms. The color blue of the hospital wall strips is here to remind you of the calm before the storm, happening all the time, every generation, for the last 1,000 years, since the great peace owner projected his perception of peace. And this is happening when you're hovering over this cluster that has some blue pieces and has some light gray pieces in them, and they're all obviously quite fragmented, so you can't really make out what you're looking at. But that's because the image that I started with was from the entrance to a park that I took a lot of times, and I was there always with my best friend as a kid, and we would also kind of, feel very safe at that place. So it reminds me of this. And right now, the conversations with this friend are quite difficult, right? Because um, every one of my friends are kind of displaced and relocated, some more willingly than others. And what I wanted to talk about was this kind of text that brings some of these metaphors without really directly talking about these stories. And also, I mentioned some things that may sound a little confusing to the viewer, but that's also on purpose. So, for example, when I'm translating uh, this great peace owner is actually, I translated literally the name of one of the kings in Ukraine. That is a very big debate with Russia. Russia claims is theirs. Ukraine claims is theirs. It's called Volodymyr Veliki. And it's actually the same name as both presidents. So Volodymyr Zelensky and Vladimir Putin, they share this name. So I didn't want to use the same name. I wanted to kind of like allude to it with the text. So the text is kind of like that, right? It's maybe I'm trying to be a little bit more poetic and metaphorical in describing these places, and also um, more like reflections on these memories. Now, so when you navigate the space, you encounter all of these places at the same time, and you can read the descriptions of them.
Allusive and elusive. um, it's a real treat to hear you speak about the work, or it's all so like beautifully thought through. So I know the piece itself is really tied up with these ideas of memory, and I want to zoom out on that a little bit, and think about how memory reflects in your practice more broadly. Like, how do you deal with archiving your work, especially with variable media? Like, do you have a practice of returning to old files in your computer? Do you I wonder maybe what the oldest file you have in your computer is.
Yeah, actually, because I started so long ago and I started with a lot of 3D scanning, I do kind of, I do have a bunch of hard drives of all of these kind of things. And some files at that time, they were just not possible for me to physically process due to the computing power. So I ended up showing some of them as these works as like physical objects that were done by 3D printer or CNC machine. But now I'm actually able to uh, do something with them, right? So for me, the idea of taking these digital things that are either built with a machine or viewed with a machine allows me to continuously kind of iterate through them and rework them and resculpt them. So there was one piece that I've done quite recently of a 3D scan of a human face, and kind of I was able to resculpt it completely after more than 10 years passed, right? So, and I think that was always uh, the kind of process I would use. I know some artists really don't like this idea of going back and reworking some of the media that they have, but I have done that uh, pretty much my entire practice, and that was actually something I have learned to do when I was a little kid going to art school in Ukraine, in the city that I'm representing in this work.
Wow. That's really cool. I feel some kinship with my process also, or like with a computer, it never has to be finished, or like you can return to these things over time and make new meaning and like adjust things as time goes on. I think that's really beautiful.
Yeah, and another thing that I want to add about the specific work. So after I built the world, right? So I conceptualized this as a world with this immersive music and text. And then I discovered that New Art City has this catalog view, and it allows people to view these objects as separate pieces. And I did not expect that uh, to happen. And I actually, even before the requirement for this festival, I decided to fill in the catalog view was the the descriptions and having these pieces to be individually viewable. So what happened is I actually reworked some of these pieces into individual sculptures. So I had to reconfigure them, and I actually included the text wrapping as a ribbon around each place. So that made a series of NFT sculptures that I posted on Tezos, because I'm a big part of NFT community still, even after the crypto crash. And I do that mostly because that's another way of uh, having presence of this digital artwork.
What is the opposite of crystallization? Crystals of memory form and dissipate in the unconditional landscape of propagated paths, diverging from synaptic randomness under the guise of selective control. How do we preserve the places that cease to exist in their physical form or are inaccessible due to forced migration or exile? When a motherland is kidnapped and the home hijacked, how can one safeguard the sense of belonging? If places can be documented in audiovisual media, how can one capture the feeling of home? Will this memory forever drift away, or can it persist? This three-dimensional mental map of the artist's birthplace in Ukraine uses an audiovisual experience to explore the notions of preservation and home through virtual placemaking. The cybernetic space is a place for meditation and reflection on the unknown from a perspective of a fleeting homeland. And I realized I don't think I turned on audio sharing, so I'm going to stop sharing and reshare.
Okay.
Okay, now we're sharing audio. So there are all these intersecting shapes, different amounts of polygons, but relatively low poly. And I can see some kind of, there's some blues, there's some very earthy tones, it's pretty compressed image textures. I can kind of make out something that looks tree-like. You can see a little bit of red and black and white that maybe looks like it's the graffiti that you were talking about. And it's very slowly rotating. And I can see there's a little text popping up in the bottom right corner that says, slowly walking forward, the saturated serenity of urban overgrowth overwhelms our expectations. Friends drift apart, losing each other through a longing to reconnect. One in a million chances. Turn down the sound a little bit.
Yeah, I think the audio is quite overwhelming.
That should be a little better.
This place is definitely not meant to be talked over, right? So, because there's only a chat option in New York City, I did not try to make this audio work with the other audio, and it's supposed to be a little bit overwhelming and just immersive.
Yeah, I think sound really, really helps with that. Is this volume okay with you, or should I cut the sound?
Yeah, it's fine.
Okay. So as I look around, I can see what you're talking about, that there are different texts popping up as I highlight different ones of the intersecting models. So there's this like cloud of rocks all suspended in this kind of spherical shape. It's definitely super overwhelming. Oh, and now all of the rocks disappeared, and all I'm seeing is this kind of dark, earthy, semi-transparent texture, and the background is all black. And
Yes.
the text that appears is, we say we will never forget and never forgive. It is easy to get lost in the day-to-day, closing our eyes and drifting into routine fantasy. We must find a way to remember and forgive every day. Sorry, I cut you off.
No, no worries. So when you drift out of the center, I use this disappearance feature in New York City to kind of show how we can get lost, right? So the idea is that uh, you are lost in the space, and then if you turn around, uh, then if you go back in the space, you'll probably encounter these again. So um, they they these shapes kind of show you if you are standing back from them and looking into this outer shell, you're seeing just kind of like this dark cave-like structure.
Yeah, now I can see all of these different like protuberances coming off of it. It looks almost like an amoeba, but I can see it's like semi-transparent and it's reflecting the light a little bit. There's sort of like a sunset HDRI reflection. And then the big cloud reappears. It's really cool how, I mean, especially understanding the metaphor of like memory kind of receding and returning and taking on this like amorphous form. It really hits. So I'm highlighting I see like it seems like the sky with some clouds, and they're like some of the shapes have little tree-like structures on them. Oh, um, it's called Kvitka fountain.
Yes, Kvitka in Ukrainian is a flower, and there's like an actual fountain with the name in my hometown. And the picture that this generated from was from that place. So if you take a 3D view, you can have this kind of 3D sphere-like um, map of the picture, so the 360 picture of it. And because this is an outdoor location, it has the sky in it, which makes these kind of blue colors. And some of the trees, the AI really distorted into something else, and some it kept. And I kind of like that idea, having these the different architectural structures, they stop being themselves.
Mm. And speaking of which, I see these like degraded looking bricks. They definitely have the AI feel. I wouldn't have necessarily guessed that they were AI, but they've got they're like these like wavy grids, and the color, it's like black and white, but the colors seem to be like separating a little bit like JPEGs do.
Yes, and I like this idea of having these low poly and low quality images for this work, because it also tells us about like how our machines actually not preserving everything that we try to preserve with them. If you take a digital photograph on your smartphone, it will not capture all of the detail that we see with our eyes.
Certainly, and it's sort of like mm, light is a continuous variable. It's a wave, and when it's captured in a computer, it's converted to bits, and there it sort of becomes more of these like discrete little chunks of information. And in the same way, memory is continuous, and information is discrete. And this one, alley with the red tiles, it seems to be blank. These are the only like crystals that seem to be almost totally white. Oh, and I see Slonic there's a little bit more stuff on there, but is there a reason why this one it seems to be unshaded?
Yeah, well, actually, in my hometown, most of the days would be cloudy. So the sky turns to this, light gray color. And because I was using all these landscape photographs, it gave me a variation in the texture. Otherwise, everything would be very highly patterned. And as a sculptor, I do like to vary things. So for me, that was just something that worked really well to give some sort of, um, visual focus point, especially in this space, because everything is around you. Everything is kind of sort of shaped the same. I know that they're all every little model has its own unique shape, obviously, but you're kind of like in this very homogeneous environment otherwise.
Right, and I can see that that model also has the really distorted trees that almost look kind of like capillaries or like blood vessels or roots. And when you get up close to it, it's super pixelated. So I've touched crystals of memory, alley with the red tiles. Where's Slonik as Kvitka fountain? It's interesting to. I didn't even clock that the visual descriptions were present in the 3D space. This is a really really cool application. Now I'm zeroed in on Slonik by the Arboretum.
So the way I intended people to interact with it is that the sculpture floats. It floats a little bit of center, so it kind of floats around you, but it floats quite slowly. So if you find one of the chunks with a different kind of text, it gives you enough time to read the description. But if someone is having a hard time, you can actually click on the object, and that text description will freeze on the screen separately.
Right, that's smart. Um, yeah, I mean, it's interesting how these like inbuilt features on New Art City are very generalized. And so there's an expected way that somebody will use them, but obviously what's most interested to me is the edge cases or like the unexpected ways that people use them.
And I like to approach these kind of metaverse spaces as an artistic tool and think about how all of these interactive features and non-interactive features can be part of the artwork.
Absolutely. It's always good to sort of think about what you're trying to do in an authentic way rather than sort of what the options are that are presented to you. So cool. So I believe we've touched all of the zones, and I was trying to read the descriptions, but I know that if somebody is visiting this on the catalog, they can just they can do that with a screen reader or no. Um, but it's really really special to hear kind of the or to connect what we were talking about in the interview in the beginning with like how it actually looks in the space.
Yeah, and the thing is, when you're in this space immersed, you may not actually touch every single part. They are kind of clustered in different parts, so it's not like you have one specific zone where the crystal is focused on this place. And because of that, that's kind of like what interactive narratives are like to me, is that you can have experience of just a part of it. And for me, that's already a complete experience for the viewer.
Absolutely. It's very, very like explorable. And I like that the sort of, since it's always moving, it was very smart design wise to sort of make it move slowly enough that you can read the text, but the memory is always kind of receding in this way.
And now I think you're outside of the shape.
Yeah.
And when you zoom out, it will eventually also disappear in the fog.
Yeah. The fog aesthetic is a very like characteristic part of New Art City, I think.
Yeah, and I really liked it. I really liked the way this fog was done. I mean, from the technical standpoint, and I think it does a lot to offer for the artists, because we are thinking about our experiences in the physical gallery spaces, or our eyes and our bodies allow us to focus on specific parts of the work. And it's very hard to do if you have this flattened out world on the screen, and having that kind of presence feeling. I think for me, that was an unexpected feature to use the fog in this kind of way, that New Art City is using it. So I really liked to explore that too.
Yeah, we always say fog is your friend.
Totally.
So how do you feel? Is there anything else that we haven't touched on that you'd like to talk about while we're still in the space?
I think it's pretty much everything. Um, I don't know. I think, the only thing that I would like to say is thank you for the technical team for coming up with this wonderful world building tool for artists, because I think it has a lot of potential and it's very easy to use for anyone. So I'm really excited to see what continues with this project.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it's such a treat to hear you talk about your work. And yeah, you painted such like a comprehensive and like well thought out um, I don't know, concept for how and why you made the piece. So yeah, thank you for making the work, and thank you so much for taking the time.